Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Stop, Look, and Listen. I'm your host, LaTroy Gardner. This week, we have a special guest. He's the author of the Puzzle Box Chronicles book series, 6 of them. And he has a new book coming out, The Local Honey.
Local Honey.
Author Shawn McCarthy. Welcome to the show, Shawn.
Thank you very much, LaTroy. Great to be here.
How you doing?
Good to see you face to face. Yeah.
Good to see you too. I heard you're in New York in a dive hotel. Just doing a little book touring.
Yeah, doing a little book touring, and unfortunately, this is college graduation time, and I'm finding that the demand for hotels in the area where I am, in the Finger Lakes, there was significantly more than I was expecting. So very tough to book a room, but we found one.
Yeah, pretty much from I'd say mid-March through Labor Day weekend. Like you just you just don't know. Like from spring break through Labor Day, like the odds are, hotels are gonna be booked. But like we said, you're on this book tour because of the local honey. So, just talk about what inspired you to write The Local Honey, and you said it in the 1950s. Why was that the case?
An interesting decade because there was a lot of transition going on there. So, I mean, I have a big interest in history. My books are always, historic in nature, at least everything I've written so far. I kind of like to do an immersion into those time periods. I try to, when somebody asks me about that, I try to compare it to something completely different. And that's, think of, fantasy books or science fiction books. All of that is about world building. When you have a historic novel, you have a world that's already built. But when you go into it, it seems a lot different than the world we live in today. The descriptions just kind of setting the scene, the background, the cars, the music people are listening to, the food they're eating, things like that. They're just going to be different then. And that sense of immersion, I think, not only gives you information about the historic nature of that time, it just kind of makes you feel like you're escaping into a different time and place. So the 1950s to me was a very pivotal time in America. And especially the early 50s, you had a lot of people who were still recovering from the trauma of the Second World War. Back then, all guys were soldiers, it seemed like. They all got kind of sucked into it. And then they came home and they came back to an America that everybody thought was going to be the same. But really, as, a few years went on, people realized we're going to be far different than it was prior to World War II. So, I mean, you got a decade that came with some really strict social rules and kind of crippling class divisions, et cetera. And even though America was enjoying a new prosperity, that prosperity could not be shared by everyone simply because of those types of separations and that. So the book is serious at times, humorous and touching, but there's always a cloud of desperation and I think like moral ambiguity that hangs over some of the characters because they're trying to survive in such a structured setting, So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk, more about any part of it as you want.
So why do you feel like when it comes to the class divides and the post-war trauma, why do you think historically that's often overlooked?
Well, I think there's certainly been a lot of books written about it, but I think there's a lot of people who just want to return to that, in their mind, the perfect 50s. Well, I think in most people's mind, the perfect 50s that we think of, that was set by the TV shows that we watched. The media that was available at the time, telling a certain story, kind of one-sided. And, this particular book is the story of a woman named Becky Bivens who was run out of town, fictional town, Riverbend, Massachusetts, but it's along the Merrimack River, north of Boston, which runs, the Merrimack River runs through New Hampshire, takes a turn and comes, across upper Massachusetts in a really industrial area that by the time we hit the early 50s was already starting to fail. In the 70s, we talked about the Rust Belt. It was sort of becoming the Rust Belt by the 50s. You saw a lot of, industry and people moving west to California, moving south, et cetera. And so there was already some poverty creeping in, and you had kind of an old guard there just trying to protect their own, protect the traditional New England, wealthy families and, screw everybody else sometimes. And so I wanted to keep the characters a little bit ambiguous as to, what their background is, what their race is, et cetera. I wanted to be, these could be any people here. This is what's affecting them because of, a well entrenched, rich group that wants the status quo versus people who are just trying to eke out a living. And so this main character, Becky, wants to come back to the family farm that her mother was chased off of because her mother was, running kind of a criminal enterprise out of there. And she wants to come back and reestablish it. And basically, she wants to be able to raise bees, sell the honey from those bees, and kind of restore the life that was taking care of her. But she has this, because of her upbringing, has this intense desire to help other displaced people, especially other displaced women, which of course ruffles the feathers of the status quo in that area because that's not what they want their town to be. So, and then the main male character of the story is a guy named Jim Yarrow, who was wounded in World War II, manages to recover, becomes a small town police officer, and he's kind of happy in the status quo. He found a good woman. He, has a good life, good job. He's a small town police officer, and he runs back into Becky, who was a woman, or a girl really, that he knew back in high school, who had a short romance with, and suddenly it kind of sets his world topsy-turvy because here's this guy who's kind of an enforcer of the status quo running into this woman who's very much the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Why do you feel like fiction is such a powerful vehicle to tell a story about our history,
Yeah.
like you do in Local Honey and all of your other
Well,
works previously?
the reality is, the history books, as the joke goes, the history books are written by the winners. And the history books are written by the people who have the time and the privilege to write their stories, tell their stories, get them published. And it is not always an accurate view of what was going on at the lowest rungs of society here. And I think there's always a certain friction because the people living on the margins are going to have an impact on the status quo of an area. And that, it makes for interesting conflict, different sort of conflict than your typical, guy meets girl or love triangle or, something that's strictly focused on one aspect. I want to tell a bigger story of this is what was happening at the time, back to our idea of immersion in a certain area.
Hmm.
And here's, in some ways, here's where we are today because of what we came through in that period and other periods. My Puzzle Box Chronicle book series was set in the 1890s. And that was looking at an upheaval in society. And what was the upheaval? Well, suddenly everybody was getting electricity. Suddenly everybody was getting access to phones. Suddenly the way we communicated and did things just changed everything for a lot of people. And that raised a really interesting conflict that you wouldn't think of. So I focused on that. I'm focusing on the 1950s for this story, and I'm dying to write a story about the 1960s, which is one of the most upheaval decades that we had in the 20th century. So we will see where that goes.
Yeah, how do you go into pinpointing which period you want to dive into? Is it that at first you're like, I want to write about the 1950s, I want to write about the Victorian period, and
Mm-hmm.
then you craft a story around it, or you kind of have a story in mind and then you tie it to that era?
I think it's the era that you know inspires me first. I think for the 1890s, and interesting, way back in my career, I actually worked at the Smithsonian institution for a while. And, being out there and being a history buff and being able to walk through those museums is incredible. And you see things like the history of communication, the history of, how Victorian, you know, uh, era affected America and things like that. So I started to have a fascination for that. And that's what led to that Puzzle Box Chronicles book. The local honey one was a little bit different because, I'm a little bit older and everybody I knew when I was a kid was a World War II veteran. I mean, literally, my dad was, uncles were, everybody I knew had been affected by that. And I would overhear their conversations talking about, oh, geez, remember such and such? Oh, yeah, yeah, he didn't make it back. And so, you realize that even though these guys are tough, they're grizzled, tough guys, and they showed no vulnerability. And you start to hear them talk with each other. That's when you realize that they were pretty affected by what they saw, what they did. And I thought that makes for an interesting story because, again, growing up when I did, you had this, everybody talked about this idyllic lifestyle of the 1950s that, oh, we seem to be losing. Not really. There was a lot more going on there, I think.
Mhm. Do you see any parallels between the 1950s and the local, box honey era and today?
I'm going to say, unfortunately, yes. I don't think the so-called 1950s status quo where, everybody's white, everybody's in the suburbs, everybody has a car, that sort of thing. That, there's an idea that some people want to return to that. Um, we're much different than that now. I think so. What the parallel is you have people who want to return to that, and how are they going to make that happen? This is a different world. It's a different place. Shut up. That's all I have to say with that.
Yeah. Like when you're doing this research, do you kind of channel like a lot of actors when they're like portraying, say, like Will Smith doing Muhammad Ali, or
Hmm.
um, Timothy Chalamet and his roles?
Yeah.
Do you kind of revert back to that era, kind of transpose yourself into the 1950s,
You
like
know,
wear clothes from the 50s, kind of
well,
live that
I do.
lifestyle?
I do try to talk about that, the clothes that people are wearing, the cars that they're driving. I mean, I love old cars, so it was pretty easy for me to say, oh, he's driving a Ford Super 8 or something, but again, that's more aimed at the immersion. As far as
Hmm.
channeling actors, I don't do it consciously. I think because we're all victims of the media, we all, we watch what we watch growing up. There's, obviously, in the back of our minds, there is that sense, that we can't avoid. But I think I tried to base it more on people I knew, as far as the guys, and as far as the women, just understanding that there are some stark choices that are faced by people. And when they get in certain situations, they may do things that morally they wouldn't do otherwise. And there has to be a sense of forgiveness of that, simply because of what people have to do to survive, So, and
Hmm.
that's what the story of Local Honey, of the people who live on this farm that Becky allows in. She kind of turns a blind eye to some of the stuff they do, whether it's theft, whether it's hints of prostitution, which nobody ever wants to come out and say, and things like that. Yet it goes on there, and the people of the town want it to be gone, And so this local cop, Jim Yarrow, in the book, who is kind of falling for Becky all over again, finds himself wanting to support her, yet at the same time realizing that he has to answer to his people, who are very much the wealthy status quo that wants to keep life 1950s, And interesting,
Hmm.
other things are going on at the same time. You're having the emergence of television and new ways of talking to people. So there's one point in the book where he takes his kids to see TV. They never seen anything like that before, and it wasn't even available to them because the nearest station was 100 miles away. But they wanted to see it because there's the whole society is moving forward in a different direction. So
Hmm. What do you hope readers take away from reading Local Honey? I botched the title in the previous question. I said Local Box Honey, so my apologies. But yeah, what sort of
that's all right.
takeaways do you want the reader
Well,
to?
I think the title's kind of a play on words. I mean, you go to farmers markets and you'll see signs, local honey, and it's been like
Hmm.
that for years. So I just thought that was funny, and obviously Becky kind of is the local honey, but that's not that's just a play on words. It's not really the focus of her. But I hope they bring away the idea that there is class division, sometimes along multiple lines. Could be racial, could be simply poverty, could be people who simply live a different lifestyle and are frowned upon by the well entrenched status quo. So I think there's great stories to be told in the tensions that come between those people, and different factions win at different times. And I think that story's universal. Going back into history as far as you want to go, I think that's always been part of the human experience.
Hmm.
Dr. Todd McLean provides periodontal and dental implant services in 2 convenient locations. They offer over a decade of experience treating patients, and appointments can even be scheduled in the evenings, weekends, or early mornings. Give them a call in Chapel Hill at 919-537-9774 or in Durham at 919-484-8338, or visit them online at gumsandimplants.org.
Let's go back to the beginning. Like what inspired you to get into writing as far as being an author? I know you taught before getting into writing full time, but just share your journey, your personal journey.
Sure. Well, it's funny. I was guess I'm lucky because I wanted to be a writer my whole life. Since I was a kid, I was, always telling stories. And I realized maybe I was always a good storyteller and I needed to learn how to write. And that was my intention. But in my, high school era, I suddenly had a desire to go in a different direction and go into pure journalism and become a reporter. And I did that for a few years. I worked for the papers in Annapolis and in this area, Finger Lakes area, Canandaigua. And I also wrote a lot of freelance stories for people like the Washington Post. I wrote several stories for. Did a little bit of work for National Geographic, a little bit of work for the Smithsonian, where I was working at the time. So that let me do that. And I realized it's pretty low pay at the low end of the journalism world. And I knew I wasn't going to, I thought I could work my way up it, but I also wanted a family. So I went back to school and got a master's degree, and I ended up working for some nonprofits and eventually became a corporate guy. But I was always writing some fiction, trying to return to my fiction desire along the way, and eventually did that with my first fiction book coming out in 2015. Yeah.
Okay. How was it going from journalism to publishing your own books?
Well, in a way, I'm going to say at first it's freeing because when you're a journalist, you have to get your facts straight, or at least that's the way it used to be. All right. I'm not going to talk about today's journalism and what passes for journalism, but I mean, when I was a reporter, who, what, when, where, why, and how, and you had to document every bit of that. Hey, somebody got arrested. Well, how do we know that? Well, here's the police report. It seems like the facts of journalism are missing sometimes in today's reporting. That set aside, when you go into fiction, you can be much more creative about it. You don't necessarily have to document everything. And when you're writing historic fiction, there's a dichotomy there. Your characters are free, but I'm not free to talk about, somebody driving a Tesla in the 1950s. That didn't happen. So you have to be true to your era and make sure that you're very factual with that. So that's where I think my journalism hat was handy. And then for the fictional characters, you can let them, unfold any way you want in order to tell the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah. Like, how does your personal experience play into your writing, as far as your upbringing, maybe your parents, just your surroundings? How did that play a part?
Okay. Well, I told you a little bit about the, my dad was a World War II vet. Not that he got into, heavy combat. He was lucky, but he was a vet from World War II. And, a lot of his friends, people I talked to as a kid, had seen heavier duty things. So I had that. I had a fairly middle class upbringing, at least middle class for, central New York where I grew up. And, went off to college and then suddenly started dealing with the real world. And when I moved into the city, moved to Washington, D.C., my middle class upbringing doesn't get me squat here. I still have to live in a pretty rough neighborhood because this is an extremely wealthy, well-connected, tough city to rent in. So suddenly I'm in, in some not so nice areas, seeing some not so nice things. So I think that was a reality check that was a real kick in the head for me. And being one who wanted to tell stories, I think that has sort of crept into the back of my mind a lot of times. And that said, in my upbringing, obviously you're always seeing marginalized people. And if you have any sense of fairness at all, you can start seeing the challenges they face. So, maybe I'm, in my, little 3-bedroom house with my family growing up. But there's people, down in the village who aren't living anywhere near as nicely as I am. And it's very easy to compare yourself to the folks living in the mansion and say, oh, look at those guys. I'm poorer than them. No, don't do that. Compare yourself to people who don't even have the lower middle class house that you're living in and understand what they're facing and all they're facing to just get up to the level you're already at, So I guess that helped me learn to tell the stories. Thank God I was able to afford to go to college, although I had to pay for half of it myself, at least, and scholarship monies, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. The cost of attend college definitely isn't like it was in the 1950s.
Oh my God, no. It's not this. I thought it was incredibly expensive when I was going through it. And I look at it now, I was like, I couldn't do that. There's no way I could afford college today, So, yeah.
Yes, like I have friends whose children are attending college, and just hearing them talk about, college being like 30, 40,000 a semester, I'm just
Yeah, yeah.
flabbergasted.
And you end up being under crushing debt when you get out, and it's crazy. So you know, there's interesting. The story from the 1950s, haves and have-nots, never goes away. We're still with it.
Yep. Um, so not only are you a junkie when it comes to writing about historical eras, you also turn that passion into renovating old homes.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
I did. When I was in Washington D.C., I got a 1910 row house that really hadn't been up there. Somebody replaced the kitchen in the 70s, and that was about it. So I I rebuilt this would have been early 90s, rebuilt the townhouse. Ended up moving to Massachusetts for career opportunities, and bought a house that was built in 1773. Renovated that. My wife was pretty sick of that by that time, so when we did sell that, we moved to a 1980s tract house. So something that didn't need nearly as much work, and then it was like, what, we wanted to eventually move to a small lake that's west of Boston, about 25 miles, and in order to afford to get on that lake, I bought a house that was very run down, but in a beautiful location. So that was what we did. We took about 3 years to just gut the place and redo all of it, and that's the retirement home. That's where I hope to stay.
Okay, cool. Um, like your writing setup, you have you have a you have additional writing support handy when you're in creative mode. Your cat being on your shoulder, peering over you and
She doesn't do that as much
making
anymore because
sure.
she's old and lazy, but she'll come for a visit, get a pat in the head and then leave. And then I have a crazy 4-year-old yellow lab who's almost 100 pounds. He's like 197 or something like that. And he's a beast, so he
Mhm.
keeps me going too. And yeah, and so it's funny. People have different ways of writing, and I used to think, I should get up and write first thing in the morning. And I realized first thing in the morning, I don't know, maybe my brain's still sludge. I don't know. I found my best writing time is late afternoon through early evening. I've talked to other
Mhm.
writers, and they all name a slightly different time that's the best for them. So I guess my advice to somebody who wants to do this: find the time that works for you, and say, I'm going to carve my time around that. Because you want to be at your most productive.
Right. So how do you deal with writer's block, even as dating back to your days as a journalist with
Yeah.
deadlines?
Well, and journalism, you just powered through it because you had to you had to make your deadline. You weren't going to have a job. So I think that was good training. So if nothing else, I try to force. Let's say I sit in my best time, and I'm still not creative. It's like, well, you know what? Let's type some sentences. Let's type some ideas. So sometimes I'll just do bullet points. It's like, what? All I feel up for today is to do bullet points. I want this chapter to say boom, ba doom, ba doom, ba doom. Leave it, come back the next day. Oh, I'm going to start expanding each. Pretty soon you got your paragraphs, you got your story, and you're writing. You're making it happen.
Hmm. Okay.
It helps
What?
have some experience with that, though. It's tough to do that in your very first book. So your very first book, most people I talked about, they get too wordy. They kind of fall in love with their own voice. I'm guilty of that too, but I think you need to say, okay, I'm going to write this, and then my next job is either to expand those bullet points or to pare down my wordiness, and you start getting a good, solid story there with the give and take between the characters, the descriptions of the scene, and it eventually happens. Yeah.
Hmm. Will there be follow up to the local honey, like similar to Puzzle Box Chronicles? Is it going to be a series or is it just a one off?
I don't anticipate it being a series. I kind of wanted to do a standalone book after going through a series. Um, that said, I've seen a lot of writers who manage to find some sort of thread between books that maybe their readers are like, aha, there's a little Easter egg. I mean, think of like Stephen King's books. He's written a few series, but most of the books that he writes are standalone. Yet many of them exist in the same town. You may mention, certain places, whether it's a diner, whether it's whatever, that has a consistency from book to book. I might be guilty of that. I might, write something else that takes place in this fictional town of Riverbend, but it won't have the same characters. It'll just have the same setting, you know?
Okay. So even with Puzzle Box, what was the challenge in doing a series? Like as far as I'm sure some of the characters carried on from one book to the next. Just like
Yes.
developing these
Yeah.
characters and pacing yourself as far as the
Yeah.
character arc.
Well, you know, it's I try to do things a little bit differently just because as a writer you try to differentiate yourself, right? So I had
Hmm.
the Puzzle Box Chronicles had these like three, which diverged down to or merged into two stories. And so for the first couple of books, you have like these three different storylines going on without the main characters meeting. And then a few of them meet, and it's what it's working towards is a conclusion because you realize, you know, some of these people have good intentions, some of these people have bad intentions, some of them are criminals, and you realize that they are overlapping and they're going to have an impact on people eventually, or each other eventually. And so I wrote the series with the end scene in mind, but realizing in order to get there, there's a lot more in the Boston area that where most of this is set and elsewhere. There's a lot more going on that's going to tell a much richer story. So, you know, those particular characters, a couple of them don't meet to the last scene and last scene of the last book. And I remember talking to
Yeah.
some people who read it. It's like, it
Okay.
surprised me. I didn't know where that was going. And I think the feedback I got is they were satisfied about it. Now, they're saying that to my face, but the reviews have been decent too. So hopefully I'm going to trust them with their judgment. You know?
Right. Well, I mean, you keep coming back for more. Like,
Yeah,
so the feedback has to
that's
be good.
that's that's what you hope as a writer too. So I wrote a couple of nonfiction books before I got into fiction. One was an internet business book called The Art of Dot Combat. I would love it if you read it, but I won't recommend it because it was talking about the internet in its early days, and that's gone. You're not going to learn anything from it the way you might have back then. And the other was a kind of advice for engineering students that I got hired from the National Society of Professional Engineers. So I like those. You know, they were fun to write, but I realized I want to get into fiction. I want to go into what I dreamed of doing when I was young. I've proven that I can write. I mean, one of my books was published by John Wiley and Sons, which is one of the biggest publishers out there. So I knew I could do it, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could do fiction. You know, so
Yeah. What's something about you that people would find most surprising?
something about me. Well, renovating the old houses was fun. I like to do a lot of stuff on the water. I've owned a few boats. I lived on a boat for a while in Washington, D.C. I currently own a pontoon boat, one of the most boring, but it's like having a living room on the water. You drive around in the pontoon boat and have friends over, have a few drinks. That's kind of where I am right now, you know, but kayaks and things like that. And when I was younger, I was much more adventurous. You know, I went and lived and hitchhiked around Europe, and I came home, and I ended up hitchhiking across the country, the U.S. I hitchhiked from California to New York. Never felt in danger. I met a lot of really good people. It was a fantastic experience that I would absolutely not recommend to anybody, but it was something that helped me gain a confidence in my life, you know, that I've tried to leverage ever since then. So,
Yeah. What do you see when you look in the mirror?
oh, I see a guy who struggled to find success but finally found it, and I think that applies to a lot of us. And married now, have grandkids, have kids, grandkids, have my little life that I worked for. And when I lived in the houseboat, like everything else that I owned at the time, that was pretty run down, and I renovated it. So in the back of my mind, when I was struggling, this is the place I wanted to get to. I thought I'd get to it by the time I was in my 30s. It took me a lot longer than that, but eventually got there. So I guess if I had to offer any encouragement to people, I'd be like, don't give up. But when I do that, I always say, don't be an idiot either. You don't bang your head against the wall if you're not making progress. Back up and find a new way to make progress. You know, I found I couldn't be that fiction writer early in my life. Backed up, became a journalist, backed up, became a corporate guy who, yeah, I did okay there, made some money, you know, raised my family. Came back to what I really wanted to do, though. And I had been doing it all the time, just not publishing any of it. So I was like, you know what? I know I can do this. Screw it. Let's do it. And, you know, it's been 11 years now, and I've got a reader base built up. That's great. So don't be afraid.
Yeah, I love that advice because a lot of times people have this vision board as far as when they would like to accomplish something, and if it doesn't go according to plan, they give up. And
Yeah,
I think a lot of times just the additional steps added into the journey helps you once you reach that point in life that you've been,
yeah,
seeking for all of these years. So I commend you for sticking to it and taking
thank
the
you.
unconventional path. And I think it helps you as far as you know everything that you're doing now.
I like to think so. You can't look back with regret. You make the choices you feel that you need to make at the time. Sometimes they're good ones. Sometimes you're not going to know until you've gone down that path for a year or so. Keep trying. Your failures say as much about you as your successes. Because if you're not willing to fail, you're maybe not going to succeed. And if you fail, I don't want to be cliche here, but they old say, how many times you get knocked down? How many times did you get up? How many times did you try again? So
Yeah, that's a question I always like to ask guests on the show: is do you learn more from your wins or your losses?
yeah. Well, getting back to Local Honey, the main male character there, Jim Yarrow. I think in the conversations that he has with his friends, often saying at a bar at night or elsewhere, it's when they start talking a little bit with suddenly their kind of collective regret, collective trauma of having come through the war, been a survivor. In the case of Jim Yarrow, he's got a wounded hand that he's still able to work, but it's always a problem for him. And you start seeing that collective trauma and the impact that it had on people. And when I sent my book to my editor, she read back and she goes, this is on one level a romance, but it's just as much a story of, she said PTSD did not exist as a term back then in the 50s. Yet, people knew about it. Back then they called it shell shocked, and there's even a little part in the book where it quotes somebody as saying, shell shocked is not a medical diagnosis. Doctors will never use that term. That's a slang term that's used by people to just sort of poo-poo the feelings that people have from the trauma. And when you have so many people together who went through that trauma together, they're going to talk and exchange stories, and you're going to realize that there's a certain sadness in there that maybe doesn't come out all the time. So that's what she said. She said this is as much a story of PTSD, regardless of what it was called then, as it is a love story. And I think she's right. And I think that probably crept into my writing because of my background more than I realized. So it was good to have somebody point that out.
All right, so we have the Local Honey being released soon.
Third week of
Soon.
June is what we're shooting for.
Third
Yeah.
week of June, but things happen.
Mhm.
Just tell us what's next. Obviously that, but beyond the Local Honey, what else you have going on, and then plug where we can find you and how we can get our hands on the Local Honey.
Well, the book will be available through the usual major retailers, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. I've been carried by some small bookstores up and down the East Coast because a lot of my stuff originates in the New England area, but ends up in some of the cases elsewhere too. But most 80% of the story takes place in New England. So I would just say look there. I am at. I gave up on Twitter. All right, which is X. I just would have made that transition. Like a lot of people, I didn't cancel my account, but you won't find anything new posted there, and that basically dates back to my corporate days. I'm on Blue Sky as Shawn McCarthy. I am on what else am I? Threads as Shawn McCarthy, and I am on Instagram. I'm not as active on Instagram, but any of those places, come find me.
Yeah, and the website is ShawnMcCarthy.com.
Yes,
Yeah.
managed to
So,
get that domain name, so that was kind of fun.
oh yeah. All
I'd
right,
recommend
cool.
anybody try to get a domain name with your name, and if you have an unusual name, you'll be successful. Unfortunately, there's a lot of Shawn McCarthy's out there. I was on a waiting list for a few years, but finally got it.
Yeah. All right. So you're making me want to go to the farmers market and grab some local honey, you know, as a result of this conversation. But
Yeah,
uh, yeah, like I said, Sean, thank you for your time. Thank you for
absolutely.
you know, the wisdom you've imparted, the drive to continue towards your passion, and then delivering um, so much literature, so much content that um, we enjoy. So
It's
we
fun.
appreciate you.
Yeah. And I look forward to listening to more of your podcasts there. The one about Luther Vandross, the singer of drawing
Uh-huh.
a blank in the name. That was interesting,
Yeah.
and some of the stuff has been fun to listen to there. So appreciate that
Well,
and your good work.
I appreciate you checking me out, and you know, you're added to the catalog. So I'm sure in future interviews, people are gonna be like, "That Shawn McCarthy interview inspired me as well."
That
So,
guy. Alrighty. Thanks, LaTroy. Appreciate it. Great
all right,
talking with you.
all
Have a
right,
great
Sean, you
day.
have a good one. And for Stop, Look, and Listen, I'm your host, LaTroy Gardner. See you next week.
Bye.
Peace and blessings.